What if I told you that China has cost the United States trillions of dollars over the past 2 decades, and there have been almost zero consequences? That's not just a theory. It's a statement backed by frustrated investors, policy experts, and now, business moguls like Kevin O'Leary. He's not pulling any punches. He's calling for a 400% tariff on Chinese goods, yes, 400%. And he says it's the only way to finally level the playing field. Today, we're diving deep into O'Leary's argument. Why is he so angry? What's the real story behind the numbers? And more importantly, is he right? Back in 2000, the world welcomed China into the World Trade Organization with open arms. It was seen as a historic moment, a sign that China was ready to become a responsible player in the global economic system. The hope was that by joining the WTO, China would open its markets, respect intellectual property rights, and follow the same fair trade rules as everyone else. But according to Kevin O'Leary, that's not what happened at all. Instead, he argues, China began bending the rules almost immediately. And not just small infractions, we're talking about systemic practices that defy the spirit of international trade. From opaque regulatory environments that favor domestic firms to direct subsidies that prop up Chinese companies, O'Leary says China has never really played fair. He points out that while foreign companies are required to jump through countless hoops to enter the Chinese market, Chinese firms often enjoy far easier access to Western economies. This imbalance, he argues, has led to a flood of cheap Chinese goods in American markets, undercutting U.S. manufacturers and distorting global competition. And the worst part? The enforcement mechanisms of the WTO are often too slow, too weak, or too politically constrained to deal with the scale of these violations. So for over 20 years, China has, in O'Leary's view, reaped the benefits of free trade while breaking its rules. Kevin O'Leary doesn't mince words when it comes to IP theft. He calls it theft on a national scale. For American businesses, it's not just about losing a product or an idea, it's about losing entire revenue streams, years of R&D, and sometimes the very heart of their competitive advantage. O'Leary highlights how products developed by U.S. entrepreneurs, software, electronics, pharmaceuticals, often find themselves reverse-engineered and reproduced in China without any meaningful consequences. In some cases, those products are even sold back into U.S. markets at lower prices, undermining the original creators. And we're not talking about isolated incidents. The U.S. Trade Representative and multiple industry groups have estimated that intellectual property theft by China costs the American economy hundreds of billions, even trillions, of dollars annually. He shares stories from his own investments, companies that launched with promise, only to be undercut by Chinese knockoffs within months. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are real cases affecting real American jobs and real innovation. O'Leary says it's a silent war that most Americans don't even realize is happening, but it's draining the country's future. For years, Washington played nice. Multiple administrations chose diplomacy over confrontation when it came to trade with China. Even as the data mounted, widening trade deficits, collapsing domestic industries, rampant IP theft, the U.S. continued to hope that engagement would eventually lead China to play fair. Kevin O'Leary says that was wishful thinking. He argues that China saw America's passivity as weakness. And it wasn't until very recently that any administration dared to push back meaningfully. Whether you agree with the policies of the Trump or Biden administrations, O'Leary credits them with finally taking a harder stance on trade, and says it's long overdue. But he also warns, it might be too little, too late. After decades of inaction, China now dominates in key sectors from rare earth minerals to electronics. The U.S. is playing catch-up in a game where the rules were ignored for far too long. As someone who has invested in hundreds of companies, Kevin O'Leary brings a unique perspective to this issue. He isn't just reading reports, he's watching the direct impact on businesses he's helped build. He explains how American entrepreneurs are some of the most innovative in the world. But innovation is fragile. Without protection, it dies. And in the current landscape, there's almost no protection for American companies trying to enter or compete with Chinese markets. He shares case after case of companies whose products were copied, brand identities mimicked, and market share stolen, all with no legal recourse. He paints a bleak picture for the future of American innovation if something doesn't change soon. Donald Trump has long positioned himself as a trade warrior, especially when it comes to China. So when Kevin O'Leary proposed a 400% tariff, it didn't take long for Trump to weigh in. His response: not strong enough. In his typical style, Trump doubled down, claiming that during his administration, he imposed the toughest tariffs in history and forced China to the negotiating table. He emphasized that without his leadership, the U.S. would have continued to be ripped off by unfair Chinese practices. Standing at a recent rally, Trump told his audience that Kevin O'Leary is finally waking up to what I've known all along. His supporters cheered as he promised to go even further if re-elected, vowing to completely decouple from Chinese manufacturing in key sectors like pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. But Trump's reaction also sparked debate. Critics argue that his trade war harmed American farmers, raised prices for consumers, and failed to achieve lasting structural reforms in China. Still, one thing's clear: O'Leary's proposal has reignited the tariff conversation, and Trump's voice is once again front and center in that debate. The 400% solution. So what does O'Leary propose? A 400% tariff on all Chinese imports. He knows it sounds extreme. But in his eyes, that's exactly the point. The U.S. needs leverage. And if dialogue hasn't worked, maybe dollars will. He says a bold move like this would force companies to reevaluate supply chains, reinvest in domestic manufacturing, and wake up the system that allowed this imbalance to grow for decades.